You're listening to Lexington Community Radio, WLXU 93.9, and this is Bike Talk.
Bluegrass Cycling Club is proud to support Bike Talk as an underwriter for Lexington Community Radio. For more information, you may visit bgcycling.net. Hi, I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Kentucky is among a handful of states that do not yet have a statewide advocacy organization for cycling and pedestrian issues. For the 2018 Kentucky Bicycle Walk Summit, planting the seeds for such an organization was a priority. And as we move forward, it's important to look at effective models in other states and the implications for Kentucky. We have a lot we can learn from other states. So with us today are three people who have vast experiences in operating and working with state coalitions across the country. Amy Johnson-Ellie is the director of the Palmetto Cycling Coalition in South Carolina. Paul Winkeller is the executive director of New York Bicycling Coalition, and Amelia Neptune is the director of Bicycle Friendly America with the League of American Cyclists. Hey, I am so excited to have you all on the show.
Thank you. What a great opportunity.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Well, I'm so glad you could be here. And before we start learning more about your organizations, we have so much to talk about. Why don't we talk about you all just a little bit so people know who they're working with today, a little bit about yourself, why you love cycling, and what you do.
So I'll start out. This is Amelia, and working for the League of American Bicyclists is sort of my dream job, the background in sustainability and a passion for thinking about behavior change and the individual choices people can make to basically save the world, save the environment.
Let's save the world.
The bike is a really obvious, we always say it's the simplest solution to all of our most complex problems. So that's what brought me to bicycling. And so I direct the Bicycle Friendly America program, which certifies communities, businesses, and universities across the country for being bicycle friendly, and we work with advocacy organizations at the state and local level all across the country to create those bicycle friendly places.
So you have great perspective on how these advocacy organizations operate and what Kentucky can learn from that. And
Yeah.
I think we'll hear a lot from you in just a moment. Amy, can you tell us about yourself?
Sure. I'm originally from Georgia. I started as a volunteer for a local bike and walk advocacy organization, and then got involved at the state level in Georgia. But I got a lot of experience as a volunteer with Bike Athens. Then I got a job in South Carolina working at the state level, the Palmetto Cycling Coalition. Some of my background is actually professional background is environmental and education, and I just decided to focus on this for some of the same reasons that Amelia said too. But I really enjoy working with trying to transform that built environment and working within the culture to get it to happen.
Awesome. And Paul, what about you? Last but not least.
I live just outside our state capital in Albany, New York. I came there by way of Boston a long time ago. My work has been running a series of nonprofits. I've also worked in government all around issues relating to sustainable cities. Got a big background in urban agriculture before biking, and a pretty long background in national service running a AmeriCorps-funded youth corps where we recycle bikes. So it's really exciting to be in Kentucky. The good news is that this state can learn from all the mistakes of those of us that have come before them to create a really cutting-edge statewide coalition representing bicyclists and walkers. And I totally agree with my colleagues. Biking is magic. Biking is the answer.
Biking is magic, and Paul keeps reminding us to remember that as we work through all of these advocacy and education issues. I think we often need to think of it more as education than advocacy as we go forward, is what we've learned a lot at the summit. So to get started, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of your organization. What can you share with us about that? How was your organization formed? What kind of structure? How are you sustained? And why don't we start with Amy?
We started a little over 20 years ago and started on memberships. Really, honestly, I should probably back up a little bit more than that, though, too. We started on free human labor for a long, long time. And that really helped create the structure of things, and it created a base. It created a reason for being there. Went through some strategic planning and really started to focus. Started to organize and keep track of all the information. Now that raised some money, a lot of that hard stuff is rightly put into the hands of paid professionals, and the volunteers now get to do a little more of the fun work. But our funding right now is split up. We've got about $25,000 comes from a specialty share of the road license plate money that actually doesn't go through an agency. It goes straight to us. That was how it was written into law originally. About another $50,000 comes from unrestricted funds like membership dollars and also some corporate money, and also a lot of money that comes from bike clubs, from rides. That's about $15,000. So there's 25 and then 50 in the rest. Right now we have about 85,000 that comes from a grant for a specific campaign from American Heart Association, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation collaboration, which is their Voices for Healthy Kids initiative. And that can't be spent any other way. And really collectively, that's the number one priority of the organization. With all of our resources, we're kind of matching that with our own dollars for a state complete streets policy campaign.
So you sound like you have a pretty diverse funding portfolio.
Yes, and that's a good idea. But you have to start somewhere. With memberships, I think, and the Share the Road plate, that was important to start there.
And Paul, I've heard you talk a little bit that it's important to start somewhere, to set your priorities, coming up with 2 or 3 years of funding to start. So how did your organization get its hold?
So again, similar to Amelia, 1990, a set of frustrated, very high-level bureaucrats in state government and city government in New York founded our coalition. That was the word back then in 1990. We were volunteers. We initially and still started with a very kind of pragmatic, real-world problem-solving approach, at the same time being strong advocates on issues like safe passing, complete streets, other issues, safe routes to schools in the early days. We have a $500,000 budget now. We've got our first grant in 1997, which was federal education funding. That was our core funding for about 15 years, and then we got pretty lucky 2 or 3 years ago, and our budget grew from about 150 to it's about 500, and it's a little bit more diverse. We're not totally dependent on government funding. Thank the bike gods for that. We have an annual bike summit, just like the one we attended here, where we generate a little bit of revenue. We have membership, same as Amelia. We have donations. We don't do any rides. We have one small ride that generates a few thousand. We're also doing over $100,000 a year now of kind of what we call expert assistance, where we utilize our network of stakeholders to drive specific projects around New York having to do with mostly bicycling and trail development. Yeah, we're lucky. We're growing. It gets harder, not easier, when you grow. I'm excited and totally jazzed by what's going on in Kentucky.
Paul, can you just elaborate on that just a little bit, that it gets harder, not easier as you grow?
Well, as you move into delivering programming relating to a variety of areas, and biking touches everything. It touches transportation, commuting, tourism, health, safety, sustainability, energy. As you grow and accomplish things in a variety of areas and people learn more about your organization, there's an expectation that when you're called upon and asked to provide help on one of these areas, and particularly in New York State, which is not New York City. New York is a huge state with multiple big urban areas. There's a lot of pressure to deliver. So actually, as we've grown, it's kind of a careful what you wish for situation. Yeah. But we love it because we know that this is a really good time around the country, as Amelia knows from LAB, and we know in Kentucky is absolutely primed to take this all to the next level with some paid staff.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. We're going to take a short break, so stay tuned in. We're going to hear from Amelia on what she's seen around the country in this respect. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram. Kentucky is among a handful of states that don't yet have a statewide advocacy organization. And as we move forward, today we're talking with 3 people who have a lot of experience and are here to share their perspectives on how to get it done. Amelia, we've been talking about, along with Paul and Amy, we have been talking about how statewide advocacy organizations get formed and what they look like. And you work with organizations all around the country in your role with the League of American Bicyclists. What kinds of organizations are out there that you've seen?
Yeah, so it was interesting preparing for this interview and for the Kentucky Bike Walk Summit to really step back and look at all the different models there are, because I found that expected there to be maybe 3 or 5 models, and there are in fact 50 models.
There's a lot.
Not every state has an organization, like you said, but there's work being done in every state. Really good work. And just because it's not formally organized into a 501c3 or what have you, doesn't mean that there's not great work being done. Sometimes it's at a city level or a regional level, and sometimes it's just collections of individuals. Dixie Moore here in Kentucky is a great example of what can get done at the statewide level.
We are so indebted to her.
So we've at the League of American Bicyclists, we've done some surveys of organizations to try to get a sense of what we call the state of the movement. And earlier in 2018, we did a survey of all of our local and statewide advocacy organizations. And just to give you a sense of the range out there for statewide groups, the largest we surveyed was 25 staff, paid staff. The smallest was 0. So there are still a lot of statewide organizations that have formal organizations but don't yet have paid staff.
And we talked before when we were preparing for this interview, most of the organizations out there are what you all call onesies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of getting over that threshold of more than one staff person is a really big challenge. And we have some organizations that are really old, relatively well-funded, but just struggle to get above that one-person status. So it's an admirable goal to get over 1. Getting your first paid staff is huge, of course, and getting your second might be even bigger because, as you've heard from Paul and Amy, there's so much work to be done.
And it's trying to develop the diverse funding portfolio that
exactly.
is more difficult than it sounds sometimes. It's getting there.
And that's another thing we've seen looking at across the nation at all the different models. You've heard 2 great models here. One other thing that we've seen work well for some places that doesn't work everywhere is events and rides. So there are a few statewide organizations that do a lot of rides, and I think that's a great potential for Kentucky, especially since you have the Bluegrass Cycling Club that already has this sort of social infrastructure for hosting these rides, and the routes are already chosen.
And we have clubs all over the state that are getting very proficient at hosting these rides as well. So there's a lot to build on.
Yeah. So turning some of those rides into fundraisers for a statewide advocacy group coalition, there's just a lot of potential there. So that's something for Kentucky to think about.
Amy, let's move on to you. So now that we've kind of established how organizations can be formed, let's look at your work with the Palmetto Cycling Coalition in South Carolina. What kind of key initiatives do you drive? And what are your purpose and goals? And how important are your partnerships in getting you there?
We try to complement the work of the local organizations. We've got a state of 4.5 million or so, and about 6 or so relatively, medium-sized cities. We don't have any large cities. Some of them might even be considered small and medium. Nothing like New York City. Because 70% of our roads are state-owned, we take the role of dealing with DOT in concert with a lot of these local movements. And so that's a big key initiative that we have right now, is working with our state DOT. We have some champions within the department, but also a lot of work to do. Our state, up until last year, spent less money per linear mile of any other state in the entire country on their roadways. And so they essentially divested at the road margins and have sort of offloaded a lot of that onto the local governments, who then turn around and say, well, it just becomes sort of a gerbil wheel. And that is a point of our advocacy, is to work with the local governments in the state to figure out who's going to address that, whose responsibility is it to work with that. We think the DOT is their responsibility, but to work in concert with the locals. And so our partnerships have really strengthened our ability to move forward, because we can't do it alone.
Yeah, and I would think that would be very important for Kentucky too, because Amelia had mentioned to me that in Kentucky, around 85% of our roads are state-owned. So advocacy with the State Transportation Cabinet and building partnerships around that, it seems, would be critical.
Absolutely. And then leveraging those champions that you already have within the DOT is also really helpful. Hosting a summit and inviting people within the system who are moving forward is a really good way to continue getting them. It does 2 things. It gives them a thank you for the efforts that they've already done within the DOT, and it also kind of helps put them in a position where they can continue to hear from people that really want to move it forward. But yeah, I see a lot of partnerships already, big opportunities in Kentucky to work with tourism and health departments and all sorts of, AARP, YMCA Alliance, or Safe Routes groups, school districts, things like that.
So it's important to build your coalition and include all of these organizations, but is it also important to be a part of other people's coalitions and insert yourself there?
Very much so. You don't want to spread yourself too thin, but there's a lot of advocacy coalitions and then also some state agency advisory committees that maybe only meet, if they meet, maybe they'll meet monthly, hopefully they'll meet quarterly or biannually, or even some of them might even meet just annually. It's really important that when somebody asks you to be on a committee, you find a way to do it. And sometimes that's a good role for a volunteer that has a limited amount of time but has a lot of expertise.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Use the volunteers and that energy in your state. Paul, what about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your organization, your goals and your key initiatives, and what kind of partnerships are important?
Just to echo what you just heard, I like to say that our mission is to get every New Yorker who wants to get on a bike for whatever reason to be able to do so as part of a safe and shared multimodal road and trail system. That's my soundbite. That's my soundbite. But that really does mean every New York, everybody on a bike for whatever reason. As a statewide organization, the way that we've grown is we've tried to identify what are things that we can do on a macro level in a very big state where there are already very vibrant local and regional bike and walking organizations and advocates, particularly in New York City. What can we do as a statewide entity to promote, to foster pro-walk, pro-bike policies? And again, we think education is key, and not just education about safe cycling, but educating our legislators about why laws have to be passed to protect vulnerable road users. We think it's very important now to work with law enforcement. We've learned that the law enforcement in New York State doesn't really know how to respond to the increasing numbers of walkers and cyclists because they literally spend 5 minutes during their training in the academies on the vehicular and traffic laws in New York pertaining to walkers and bicyclists. Also, education relates to tourism, and we need to promote the fact that, particularly in upstate New York and on Long Island, that there's huge opportunities to drive local economic development. Upstate New York still has missed the multiple booms that have happened in the late 20th century. So engine of economic development is people on bikes spending money. So education's key, and then we fit all that in with a 30-year network of partners in and outside of government who look to us to lead and drive public policy. It's complicated, but it's a lot of fun.
And always remember to enjoy riding your bicycle. All right. We're going to take another short break and we'll be right back with you. So stay tuned in. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram, and we're talking about statewide advocacy for cycling because Kentucky doesn't have a statewide advocacy organization yet. But right now we're talking with some folks from states that do, and they're offering some great ideas and models and food for thought to help get us started. So Paul, let's pick up you again. We're kind of thinking about what are some of your biggest successes and surprises, good or bad, some struggles that you've had that might help Kentucky know what to look out for, what we can do differently. And one thing I've heard you talk about is how you actually vocalize your advocacy efforts, that saying you're doing advocacy is not always the best idea.
I can't really explain how it happened, but somehow the word advocacy has become a very charged word. So what we try to do, and we're having our own bike summit in New York, also the second bike summit, just like Kentucky. We have actually framed the entire track of panels, about 20 panels, around the word education. Words are important when you're launching a statewide group, and we feel like we know what advocacy is, but we also know that it really is all about education. Again, whether you're talking about legislation or law enforcement, tourism, or providing technical assistance to organizations at the local and regional level, that we all know that as bicycling and walking become mainstream as sort of a cultural thing to do, and a really flavor of the month in America, that we don't want to slow down that momentum by scaring people off with our language. As Kentucky frames their launch to a statewide organization, the point that I probably said too much at the summit was really think about that language. And if you can start off on a tone that's not threatening, but is really kind of smart, data-driven, fact-based, real world, then you can be an advocate without saying you're an advocate. And you can really accomplish perhaps more than you thought in a quicker time frame.
Well, Paul, and you also talked about tourism, the importance of thinking about this as economic development in tourism as opposed to putting more local bikes on the road.
Tourism is again, we heard at the summit from Adventure Cycling, from their wonderful leader, Jim Sayer, that bike tourism is exploding. We're sort of catching up to the rest of the world, perhaps, especially Europe. But the way tourism responds, remember, bike tourism, even bike tourism with pedal assist electric bikes, which dominates in Europe and is coming here, bike tourism is low impact, sustainable, it's green, it enables partners and couples who may not be at the same place to bike together if there's an electric option. So tourism, and the same with the health benefits of cycling and the commuting as bikes as transportation, you can frame all this two-wheeled and three-wheeled activity around a variety of issues that are not threatening and really make a lot of sense.
Thanks, Paul. And Amy, with your work in South Carolina, what have you found to be your biggest successes, some of your surprises, good and bad, and some of your biggest struggles? What would you do the same? What would you do differently?
We'll just start with the success. Once we started partnering, we're lucky enough to get some grant money to help have me hire somebody to help push the state Complete Streets policy campaign forward. We really saw some traction. I think even if I hadn't gotten this extra capacity, simply partnering was a big factor because our DOT was listening in a way that they hadn't listened before. In fact, I think we scared them a little bit because we brought more partners into the room. And so for a little while, we weren't hearing anything. It seemed like a step back, but about 6 or 8 months later, they allocated $5 million, which was a brand new thing that they were doing for a dedicated vulnerable road user safety program, which was a 10% of their federal allotment of highway safety dollars.
Was that totally unexpected?
No. Yeah, that was something we wanted. And I think the minority of states out there actually have successfully done that. But we've got pretty bad numbers. I mean, we're number one traffic fatality overall rate in the country. We're number 3 or 4th worst pedestrian fatality rate in the country and number 6th worst bike fatality rate in the country. I think they recognized they needed to do more. Partnering made them listen, and we brought data. I think it's the partnerships that made them kind of rethink their data in a way, because data can be spun in different ways. That, I felt like that was a success. Something that didn't work out that I am still struggling with, and it might have had to do with capacity at the time, is that about 6 years or so ago, when I took on the job, there was a social infrastructure, a network of planners and engineers around the state that had been created. And the idea was to create sort of a best practices sharing forum. And that was difficult to sustain that as the advocacy organization. I think it's something we need to kind of revisit to really provide that forum for local planners to learn from each other. Because if you can say, hey, an hour away, they used this funding source to build this trail. That's a probably twice as strong of an argument as saying California, they built that trail with that money, and so we can do it here in Kentucky. So if you have Louisville saying, hey, this is what Lexington did, or if you can have Lexington say this is what Louisville did, and this is how they did it, that kind of knowledge sharing and kind of collection of that information can be really helpful. And so that was something that I feel like if we could go back and do that again, I would try to find a way to
So information is power, and connectivity is very powerful too. Mm-hmm. So maintaining that. And you also were talking about data, the importance of data. And I think all three of you were talking, or it may have been Amelia, that said we have so much data that we can build upon. Can you address that? How and why is that important?
I think that data is just critical. Also equally valuable are your value statements, how you message something, the words you choose. But if you can pair that with data, and then you're citing somebody else's resource, referencing another...
You have a third-party resource.
It's almost like partnering with somebody. Hey, so-and-so said this, and I'm speaking it, and I agree with it. And then the more data, then you have another source. Then all of a sudden, you're really elevating the public interest level of what you're doing and what you're saying.
And Amelia, you had presented data from Kentucky and suggested ways that we can use that data that comes from the League of American Cyclists.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do at the League is every other year we rank all 50 states on how bicycle friendly they are. And we do that looking at a whole bunch of different data that folks within the state provide for us, or that's publicly available, sort of federal data. I think a lot of these numbers, it can be difficult and dry to look through all of it, but
they're important.
They're really important to know where you are, to help you figure out where you want to go, especially when you're looking at things like safety, number of traffic crashes, fatalities, number of riders. If you don't know those numbers, it's very difficult to make an argument that you need changes, or that safer measures are called for. Being armed with numbers at the local, very, very hyper-local level, the regional level and the state level is going to be really important, I think, to taking any kind of political arguments. And I think it's a form of education to say, hey, did you know that we rank 43rd as,
Yes.
out of all 50 states, we're number 43 here in Kentucky in bicycle friendliness. And here's what we need to do to improve. Let's go do that. The safe passing law that we've been talking about, that's one of the things that we really recommend every state figure out a way to do. And Kentucky, it's very exciting to see it have happened here. So there are other actions like that we recommend. And I think an important point to make here is that Kentucky is unique in a lot of ways. We touched on this already with with the percentage of the roads here in the state that are owned by the state. That's a really important distinction. And I think some of it's because it's such a rural state. But even within the urban centers, 2/3 of urban roads are still state owned. And that's a really unique factor that makes working at the statewide level and building that kind of coalition really critical, because you need to be able to influence the cabinet and not just Louisville or Lexington. It's across the whole state. You need that common voice.
If I can just say one more thing about numbers and data, this might translate to Kentucky. When you're working at the state level, being able to use numbers and explain that these are state priorities, that helps, at least for us, it helped us drive that state conversation, because our DOT, it might just be South Carolina, but we've had some history where there's been a lot of legislators that'll just make a phone call and they'll get a road done because it's a favor, and that was really frowned upon. So
that never happens here.
No, of course not. But I think that kind of using numbers and partnerships, forming those partnerships, really, and explaining that you've got something that should be a state priority is important. And kind of guessing that this translates across to any state, really, that when you're working at that level with so many roads that are state-owned, if you can drive the conversation with some broad-based, data-driven reason.
Absolutely. Those are excellent points about data and how to use it, which brings us to the point that it's time for another break. So we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Welcome back to Bike Talk on Lexington Community Radio. I'm your host, Wanda Bertram, and we're talking about statewide advocacy for cycling because we don't have a statewide organization here in Kentucky. And we're joined by 3 people from outside of Kentucky who have been sharing about their statewide advocacy coalitions and things that Kentucky should be thinking about as we move in that direction. Paul, you're from New York, and one thing you keep reminding us is that bikes are magic. And we just finished talking about how important data is and how to use data, but there's a qualitative side to that magic too.
We were also talking about how we work with our key state agencies, particularly in a state like this, which is so dominated by state roads. Qualitative aspects are get your stakeholders and your partners out on a bike. Get them on an electric bike. Get them on a new trail. Bring the media and make them look good. while you underpin your arguments around data and what's happening around the rest of the country, we know more people are riding and walking and want to ride and walk, and we know that communities are doing complete streets, and we know we're making connections so that our systems are complete. If we can get our thought leaders and our elected officials and our planning and engineering community out with us that really believe strongly in this magical dimension of pedaling, I think that can really kind of counterbalance that demand now that kind of reduces everything we do in this culture to numbers. And as we try to build a coalition in Kentucky, I really strongly advise that we just get people out cycling, because I know that everybody smiles after they get off a bike.
Yeah, I always joke that when I go for a run, when I come back, I'm not smiling. When I go for a bike ride, I'm smiling the whole time and the bugs in my teeth.
Happy runner. You never see happy runners. It's like, why are you running?
Here's to all the runners out there in our lives. We love them. Paul, we're going to go back to you for just a minute. What advice do you have for Kentucky as we start thinking about forming a coalition?
I would think really hard. You have the opportunity to learn from a lot of mistakes, including ones that we've made and have made in Palmetto and we know have made around the country, to build an organization with a really great foundation. And one of the ways you do that is to make sure that you're early, before there's an incorporated 501c3, that your initial stakeholder group is diverse in every way: age, gender, race, and interest in biking, because we know that there are a lot of angles to this thing. There's energy, there's recreation, there's health, there's commuting, there's people that don't want to own cars and aren't adequately served by public transit. So get a really broad group of stakeholders together that reflect Kentucky and put them to work to create a common vision and a short and long range plan, and you'll succeed. There are best practices out there that you can learn from in this state, and you're not going to be 43rd for long.
I hope not. Amy, what kind of advice do you have? I know one thing that we have talked about a lot and heard about a lot is the importance of strategic planning, for one.
I think it's important. It's not always an easy thing to do. It takes time. Sometimes you need to hire a facilitator to help you through it, but it's really important. And you can have fun. Like you host a little social event beforehand, a social event afterwards. It can be fun. You can have whiteboards all around the room and Post-its and all sorts of ways to really to make it work out. But it's very important, because if you don't do it, you're going to spin your wheels. You've got to have everybody around the table to partner, and then pick a project or two or whatever's manageable. And then you've got
Focus,
and then figure out when you're going to do it. What are the steps? Give yourself a little flexibility in there. Don't get too OCD about it. And then who's going to do it? And then you've got to assign somebody to call on those people and find out if they've actually done it yet. That's probably the last step people always forget.
And one thing that I've heard you say too is that it's all about the volunteers. The volunteers are the base.
They are. And I think volunteer recognition is really important too, especially with Kentucky working on forming one right now. During the summit that we saw, recognizing those volunteers is very important for so many reasons, because it's a lot of hard work. People don't do it for the recognition, but it's always nice and gracious to kind of give that to them. The other thing is just, always have fun with it. It's a state organization. You can't always just have everybody involved meet that night for an event, but you can, through a statewide conference, coordinating with local groups, you can make a point, like physically see each other and maybe go on like a history bike tour or something.
The magic of webinars.
Yeah.
Amy, you also believe in having a strong board, and I think you use the word fresh.
Definitely. I think there should be some term limits and fresh.
Yes, young. Make sure you involve young people. I'm not a young people, but I think there's a really strong desire on young professionals, especially how in our busy lifestyle, in our busy world, can I have an impact? And you really can see an impact when you're driving policy to get more people walking and biking. It's immediate. There's a lot of positive reinforcement, and I think that as our world sits at desks all day and answers emails and looks at spreadsheets, that there's just a booming desire for people to get out and give back, and this is a great way to do it.
Yeah, so find those young and energetic people.
Yes, people in their 20s with no kids and lots of time.
Yeah,
So that's very helpful.
Yeah. So, Amelia, in your work with Bicycle Friendly America and the League of American Cyclists, what kind of advice would you give Kentucky?
Yeah, well, I definitely echo everything that Paul and Amy have said. Getting a really great, diverse board, getting all voices involved, making sure they feel welcome and invited to share their perspectives. Because just saying, hey, you're invited is one thing, but really listening to them
It's a big
is another.
difference.
Yeah,
Listening.
yeah. So I definitely encourage everyone involved in organizing to sit back and think about that and make sure you're sort of creating space for those voices that might not feel like they have a reason to speak up or show up. Go to those communities that might not be represented, past meetings or even parts of town, those kinds of things. Really try to meet people where they are to get those diverse voices included.
Well, and that's a good point, to not expect people to come to you.
Yeah.
You have to go out to them and their communities and be a part of where they are.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done.
And just to echo that, one of the things at this early stages of forming a group is try to figure out, it's almost like an ecological approach to organizing, try to figure out what it is a statewide entity in Kentucky can do that no one else will do, that will respond to exactly what's going on both in the rural areas and the urban areas. What are the niche projects, the niche connections, the elected officials and government officials that need maybe more information or to get on a bike? What can you do as an entity that no one else would do to move things forward? That's another way that every state coalition is unique and different in that there are different things to respond to based upon what's happening.
Excellent point.
Yeah, I would, again, echo that. And every state has different priorities for those reasons. And there are laws on the books that really vary from state to state. So as you're forming this coalition, really familiarize yourselves with what's on the books and what's happening in practice in Kentucky so that you know what issues to prioritize. And maybe it's a law on the books that hasn't really been thought about or enforced, but it's something that's going to mess up a future bike plan down the line. There are sort of surprises along the way for states that we've seen that face challenges. Yeah, educate those involved, educate yourselves on how policy works and what policies are in place, because that's something we can't tell you from other states or from the national level. That's something that's going to be really specific to Kentucky, and it's important to know it really well.
So if you want to hear a great example, in New York, we sort of think we know everything about, as the 30-year-old coalition about public policy. We just learned that in New York, there's been a law on the books for years. I bet it's on the books in Kentucky that mandates in the third grade bike and pedestrian education. And it's an unenforced mandate in New York. There's no teeth behind it. And when we approach our friends in state government, and really, state government has been great the last few years, they're not able to respond because of Common Core issues and also maybe lack of resources and political will. So what we did in New York was we said, well, if we can't get them to enforce this mandate to turn young people onto walking and biking as a lifelong healthy skill, how do we do it? And we figured out, our smart staff figured out that the way into schools is phys ed teachers. Mm-hmm. So in New York, which is a very high regulatory and a lot of organization state, there are regional groups of phys ed educators that meet quarterly. So we present them with our curriculum. They're thrilled to have it. And bam, all of a sudden, kids in New York at the third grade are by the back door receiving that mandate to be turned on to walking and biking.
Wow, excellent story and a great example of how to form new partnerships and work with your environment and to know your environment and what you're dealing with. That's all the time we have for today's show, unfortunately, because this has been so incredibly interesting and motivating to me. I'd like to thank our guests again, Amy, Paul, and Amelia, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I'm so glad you came to Kentucky and were with us for the Bike Summit. You made such an impact with your knowledge and with your sharing. So don't forget to tune into Bike Talk at the same time next week for all things cycling, helping you get out, explore our towns and countryside in Lexington and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Be safe and enjoy the ride. Because bikes, after all, are magic. Bluegrass Cycling Club is proud to support Bike Talk as an underwriter for Lexington Community Radio. For more information, just visit bgcycling.net.